Well or otherwise, did the main party leaders run their election campaigns? With me are the Conservative advisor Joe Tanner, who worked with Boris Johnson in his mayor years, and the former Labour policy advisor Sonia Sodha. Welcome to you both. Now, Boris Johnson, did you ever have your worries in the course of this election campaign?
I didn't actually. I couldn't call it. Even last night, I was looking at the exit poll game.
You were having a party, weren't you?
I was having a party. Yeah, I've done that for the last few years, and it was the most. I actually got a picture of the group in the room that just. You could see everyone gasp when it came in because people didn't know. There was a palpable sense of no one could call it yesterday. So there was a degree of shock. You know, there'd been an awful lot of commentary about how Boris was conducting himself, the issues about interviews he was doing, and you just couldn't call it.
I always thought the most likely outcome was that the Conservatives were going to get a small majority, but I was completely blown away by the size of the majority. It just came as a huge shock to me when the exit poll came out at 10 o'clock last night. It wasn't something I was predicting. It's not something that any of the polls had predicted. So, yeah, it was a huge shock.
I mean, one of the things we knew all along was that on approval, or rather disapproval, Boris Johnson was much less disapproved of than Jeremy Corbyn. Do you think that was what it all hinged on in the end?
Absolutely, it was a factor. And, you know, we've had a lot of Labour MPs sort of calling for a period of reflection now. I'm not sure that much reflection is needed, actually. I think it's pretty obvious if you look at the result last night. There are a number of very serious problems. Some people have argued, well, it was just Brexit that was Labour's problem, and if Brexit hadn't been on the table...
Well, that's what the sort of message from the Corbyn-McDonnell campaign is.
Absolutely, and there's no question that Brexit made it harder for Labour, but it was absolutely... Corbyn's leadership was absolutely a factor. We had reports filtering back from the whole campaign, from Labour MPs in the north and in the Midlands, out on the doorstep, saying that Jeremy Corbyn was just not landing with people on the doorstep. They were saying they didn't want to vote for him. I think Labour's manifesto was another big problem. I think there are a lot of policies in that manifesto that you ask voters whether they like individually, and they say, oh yes, we like free broadband, we like the idea of that. Then actually, when you presented them in a manifesto to voters, I think people took a look at it and just thought, gosh, the idea that we could have all of this stuff and not have to pay for it, like no one's got to pay for it apart from the top 5%. I think voters just didn't think it was credible. So I think it was all those three things. I think it was Corbyn's leadership, I think it was divisive leadership, I think it was a manifesto, and I think it was Brexit that made it such an appalling defeat for Labour.
So let's just have a listen, because we've caught up with the Shadow Brexit Secretary, Kearse Tama, who's been meditating on Labour's defeat.
There's no hiding from the results. They're devastating for our party, devastating for our movement. But most importantly, they will cause even more hurt to the millions of people who've suffered so much on the Tory government. Obviously, we've got to reflect on this, and we've got to reflect on this together as a party and as a movement and try to properly understand this result. But it's also our duty to rebuild our party and our movement, and that's going to be a very, very big task.
Would you like to be the next leader?
Well, I think this is the time for reflecting and understanding the result. I don't underestimate the size of the task ahead as we try to rebuild our party and our movement. Thank you very much.
I mean, they're not your team, but I mean, what would your advice be? Make quick changes or slow changes, and how radical would those changes be?
I think they've got a big challenge because one of the problems around the group that don't want Corbyn is that they haven't been able to work out who they do have then. You know, they've not really been able to corral around anyone. And we've now got the void where we've got no deputy leader because of Tom Watson's vacation. So you've ended up with a situation where even actually, to be honest, all the blame is going on Corbyn. But let's face it, McDonnell was behind the manifesto and had a key role. There is a whole team around these people. The leader themselves do not take the full blame of what happens. So ultimately, if you're going to have a manifesto launch, for example, and you're going to release policies where your shadow cabinet didn't even know about them until they appear in the papers or they're on the 10 o'clock news, you're not going to win elections because you're not a proper team. And to all credit to the Tories, actually, what they've managed to do for once
this
time, I mean, who knows how long it will last, but they ran a very disciplined campaign and they actually stuck to key messages, which I think actually, if you look at it, also the Lib Dems, I think they probably put the work in around properly doing the research, focus grouping the policies, whereas I think Labour didn't, because some of that stuff was being kept from their own politicians. And I wonder what happened with the Lib Dems. I don't even think they tested what they were talking about, because it landed so flat. Who on earth had they tested that against?
I think it was, again, individual policies work, but not the totality.
Yeah.
But just quickly on Labour, I mean, talk about personalities, even talk about Brexit. But, you know, those core policies are very different from New Labour core policies. And if Labour sticks by those, does it have a chance?
I don't think the 29 manifesto is going to be a winning manifesto for Labour in 2024, say, any more than it was in 2019. I also don't think, though, that the 1997 Labour manifesto would be winning for Labour now. I mean, we're sort of 20 years on, we're living in a completely different world. I think Labour's got to find a sort of policy offer that communicates to voters what it's about, but that's also credible, that people look at it and they believe it's something that a Labour government could deliver. But I think a manifesto only ever gets you so far, and that's one of the takeaways of this election, because look at the Conservative manifesto. I mean, apart from Get Brexit Done, it was incredibly thin. It hardly had anything in it. And I think in this day and age, more than ever, who your leader is and how they resonate on the doorstep, and whether voters look at that person and think it's somebody that they can trust to deliver, is really, really important.
Well, Boris Johnson, the best-known politician in the land, now Prime Minister in his own right with a large majority. You know him. What sort of a Prime Minister is he going to be?
I suspect, actually, given the result, I think he's got to do a little bit of thinking about who he wants to be and how he's going to run. And I kind of hope he does. I mean, there's rumours now that the Queen's speech might not be as early as next week. I've heard it could be later, which, if that's the case, I think would be very sensible.
Well, that'd be the new year.
It would be sensible to do so, because the reality is that, you know, we have had a Conservative Party that's been defined by, you know, the ERG and that very, very focus group on getting out of Europe. And actually, if he's able to look again and think, well, hang on, what are the things I want to get through? We know that Boris likes doing stuff and building stuff. We saw that in London. And I think he's going to be focused on a legacy.
This sort of drive for the election, clearly, you know, Dominic Cummings has been one of the masterminds. I mean, do you expect him to carry on being an influential presence?
I suspect he'll be influential, but there was always talk of Dominic moving on and other people that were going to step up. So Sir Edward Lister was going to take a more key role. And actually, I suspect going through this period, they are also going to have identified other people. They've even lost some people, so people like Andrew Griffith, who was actually was one of the key figures within Numbers. He's now an MP, so they're still going to be around. But obviously, he's also got a bit of flexibility with the cabinet. He's got posts to fill. He's got the Welsh secretary. He's got Nicky Morgan's old job needs to be filled. There's been all this talk about whether Sajid Javid's going to continue. So ultimately, he's got a little bit of time now to think about how he's going to make that work.
Like you're saying, don't rush into it.
I think he should get on with Brexit, because that's what he's told people he's going to do. That's one thing. But I think actually some key policy decisions and what the stuff he's going to do quickly, what that list looks like, I think a little bit of thought is not a bad idea.
And of course, there's going to be a lot of big decisions to make on Brexit, because leaving on the 31st is only the first step. And I think one thing we're going to have to watch very closely in the coming months is what is the influence of the ERG, the hard right Eurosceptic flank of the Conservative Party. They've always had a lot of influence over the last 10 years, because
they've now been elected on Johnson's manifesto.
They have, but now that Boris Johnson's got a really large majority, he perhaps has to pay them a bit less attention than David Cameron and Theresa May did. So I think watching that dynamic is going to be quite interesting. And I think we're really going to see what sort of Prime Minister and what sort of man Boris Johnson wants to be. He's got no excuse now. He's got a massive majority. And if he takes the country down a very hard Brexit, it'll be because that's what he wants.
OK, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you both very much indeed. This is Sky News. Coming up,